and the customary $100 wine voucher. So I've just opened up my new M3 subframe bushings I sourced through Turner Motorsports, and while I still have them off the car, I wanted to go over them and just do a quick comparison of these M3 bushings next to the 335is bushings that I have. I've actually managed to get these off the car. Anyone who's done any research on changing the rear subframe bushings out in favor of M3 or polyurethane or any of the other like solid aluminum ones knows how notoriously difficult these can be to get off the car, especially for those who are tackling the job with the subframe still in the car. Luckily for me, doing the entire overhaul, my subframe is out. So I was able to get these two out. Now, granted, they were still pretty difficult. There's a lot of force that you have to use in order to get them out. I'll go over the kind of the contraption that I created to do that. Doing a closer examination of the non-M bushing, you can see right off the bat this void here where there's no rubber. In fact, the mounting portion of the bushing kind of just floats in there, and you can see the light right through it. Now, this is the front-facing bushing, and this is the rear-facing bushing. Now, this one's slightly more robust, but it still has the same voids. You can see the light right through it. Comparing these two to the counterpart M3 bushings, these are solid rubber. In fact, having them in your hand, you can just feel how much more hefty they are. The rubber feels harder, and the mounting portion is completely surrounded by rubber, so there's not going to be any give on these. And what give there will be, it won't be nearly as noticeable. Just by comparing these two, you can see why these are so notoriously failure prone on non-M cars. If we think about a car that came with 300 horsepower, 300 foot-pounds of torque from the factory, adding larger turbos, more power, I mean, if you're just increasing the power slightly above stock, you're probably already stressing these bushings to the max. So for me, if you're building one of these cars and you're looking for that best bang for your buck sort of suspension modification, aside from maybe coilovers, I would probably recommend this. Now, the downside is they're a pain in the ass to do, and I'm going to get into that in a moment. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to link in a section of a video from ECS Tuning that shows a non-M rear subframe under load, and you'll be able to see the amount of flex taking place. If you've ever looked into sourcing the BMW specialty tool designed to take these bushings out, you know how costly it is. It's about $250 to $300 depending upon where you source it. There are also a lot of horror stories about people breaking those specialty tools during the install and having to buy another one or come up with another method. So what I've done is I've done this on the cheap, and I've spent about $30 or so at Tractor Supply, and I kind of came up with my own. So I started off with a 1 foot section of 5/8 by 11 all thread, a couple of nuts to fit it, some 1 3/4 inch fender washers, a couple of 2.5 inch fender washers, and then a lawnmower pulley that has a 3-inch diameter. And you can see the amount of force I needed to pull the old ones out or push the old ones out. It's already smashed this to a high degree. And then this is a Yeti mug I had, and I chose this. One, I was willing to part with it, and two, it has a 3.7-ish, so about 3 3/4 inch inside diameter, which is just enough to clear the bushing. So I just kind of drilled a hole in it and modified it. And then I have my 2 stock spring perches. Now the Öhlins kit I'm running obviously has its own spring perches it comes with, so I was willing to part with these. I just simply cut the top off, and this is how I kind of get the whole thing started. So next what I'll do is I'll kind of put this on the subframe and show you how I used it to push the old bushings out, and then hopefully I'll be able to push one of the new ones in. Okay, so here's my setup. So I wasn't able to hold the camera and set it up to show you the setup, but I'll just walk you through it. So the all thread is all the way through the bushing. Now I have it fastened to the cup over here. I have the pulley here and the washers here to push the bushing left into the cup. But really you could set this up anyway. You just want to have a larger flat surface here and here to keep things from collapsing and to keep the pressure evenly spread, or as evenly spread as possible on the bushing. So another thing too that I noticed as I've been pushing the new ones out and the old ones, well, the new ones in and the old ones out, is that this piece right here, you notice that the subframe is welded. This is 2 pieces. You'll even see the gap here where the bushing is. I've been noticing that this is tending to collapse as I push because there's a tremendous amount of force needed to pull these out and push the new ones in, and I'll get over that more in a moment. So what I've done is I've just found a socket that fits in here. I've stuck it in here, and that'll keep the structural integrity of the subframe from collapsing in on itself. And the last thing we want is to put this back in the car, and there's any changes to the shape of the subframe, we don't know what sort of adverse effects may come down the road from that. All right, so you'll have to have something holding the nut in place on this side, and then we're just gonna take our wrench, and then we're just gonna gradually tighten this bad boy down. Of course, it's going to get much more difficult. So as you can imagine, it took a lot of force to push that old bushing out, but not nearly as much force as it took to push the new bushing in before stripping the all thread. And this is how much I still have to push. So my wife was sitting on the subframe like a motorcycle with both hands holding the wrench to keep the nut in place here, while I stood over this with a wrench and pushed with all my might with both hands. And I'm a pretty strong guy. And I will tell you, I was waiting for something to break, and thankfully it was just the thread stripping out. So I'm gonna have to cut this off. And what I'm gonna have to do is I'm gonna have to pivot to pushing them in with a shop press. So I've read online of people just using the shop press. That's typically what your shops are gonna do if they do it for you. So we're gonna put a lot more force than I can offer with my own strength. So, at this point, I've read stories of people putting these bushings in while the subframe is still on the car. I've read stories of people putting in the solid aluminum bushings, which I can imagine have even more friction. And I gotta tell you, I don't know how they did it. So my message here is, if you're gonna do this mod and you're gonna do it yourself, you're gonna wanna pull the subframe out of the car. I know that sounds like a horror story, but really it's not that bad. So you gotta disconnect the drive shaft, and the drive shaft is tight. It's a pain in the ass to get off. And then you're gonna have to take the brakes apart. So you're gonna have to bleed the brake system when you put it all back together. But the additional hour and a half's worth of work to get the subframe out, maybe 2 hours, is well worth it, because the amount of pressure that it would take to push these bushings on, I don't know how anyone would do it without blowing their elbows out. So take the subframe out of the car. It's a little bit more time, but it'll be a much easier job. Let's go ahead and pivot to the shop press next. So real quick, while I still have one of the original bushings in, I wanted to kind of go over the difference in how it feels and how it moves versus one of the M3 bushings. I already have one of these installed. So if I use a pry bar and just kind of stick it in here and start moving it, if I move it back and forth and up and down, side to side, you can see it moves with very minimal effort, and it moves a lot. So this up and down actually in the car would be back and forth. So this would be under acceleration and braking. You can see how much it would move. Comparing that to the M3 pry bar, I'm putting a lot of force on it, and it is not moving at all. So I can already tell this upgrade is going to make the subframe and the car in general feel much more planted, not only under acceleration, under braking, cornering. So already I can see that this mod is going to pay dividends. Okay, clearly I messed up. So I found out the hard way why there's a saying that says haste makes waste. So I tried to go a little bit too quick on pushing these in, and I've said there's a lot of force required to get them in. And what happened is I had this on the press, and I was using one of the washers, and I started to press down, and it was uneven, and it did one of these numbers, and it crushed it. So I had to wait a couple days while ECS Tuning sent me a new one, about a $65 mistake. The reason all this is chewed up is because I had to break these tabs off in order to be able to push it out so the cup would fit into it. This one's just a little bit too big. So if you're going to do this, take your time, make sure everything's lined up. I know better than that, but again, I was trying to get things done in a hurry. What I recommend, before you put the subframe in the press, start the new bushing out by hand with whatever tool you're using. In this case, I'm using my DIY tool that I created. This way here, it'll ensure that the bushing starts in straight rather than going in crooked or at any angle. I'm pretty sure that's why I ended up destroying the other one, was because I put it in and I was trying to hold the subframe up and have it inside of the press, and it just ended up going in crooked, and then before I knew it, the washers were shifting and it cracked and destroyed that first bushing that I attempted. Also too, you'll notice, as I mentioned before, that I have a socket sitting in between here. So just find a socket in your assortment that will fit in there nice and snug. And then this will keep this from compressing. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and get this started to a depth that I feel comfortable with, and then I'll go ahead and put it on the press, and I'll kind of show how I have that set up. Now I have the subframe in the press, and I have it put in a way to make sure that it's not pressing in on anything but that ear where the bushing is. So it's not, you know, accidentally warping or pushing out of shape any of the other components, because remember, this goes back on the car, it has all the suspension on it, so it has to go back in perfectly in the original condition. I'm keeping the socket here to keep this these two parts here from compressing in on each other. I have the press with a few washers to spread out the load, and I have it centered. So I'm gonna go ahead and start pushing this in and just watch and make sure it goes in evenly, and we'll look for any unevenness, which I don't see, so it is going in. And finally, the bushings are in the subframe, and the subframe is ready to go back in the car. So I would say this took me probably about 2 to 3 total hours, spread out over the course of a week. Recall I had the setback where I destroyed one of the bushings and had to wait a couple of days for the replacement to come in. But all in all, 2 to 3 labor-intensive hours to get these in. And you know, part of that 2 to 3 hours was spent developing my tool and the approach and just how I was going to attack this. If I were doing this job again, I think I could certainly do it in less than 2 to 3 hours, knowing what I know now. So to wrap this video up, I'm going to go ahead and get this reinstalled back on the car, and I'll kind of go over just some things you want to make sure you do in order to get it set on the car straight. Ready to reinstall the subframe in the car. Now there is a brace that BMW makes to make removing and installing the subframe easier. Obviously it's probably pretty expensive and hard to source, so I just made my own out of 2x6. So very rudimentary construction here. So what you want to do is make an L 16 inches from here to here. And then from top to bottom, you want it to be 5.5 inches. And then I took this little notch out here so that it fits perfectly in between the differential bushing mounts. So what you'll do is you'll set the wood on your jack pad, and then you set your subframe on there, and then you kind of get it centered and balanced, and that'll allow you to wheel it under your car and be able to lift the subframe into position more square and accurately. Last thing I want to note before I wrap up is the mounting pins. So the mounting pin that centers the subframe is underneath the driver's side, and it's right here. Now it's perfectly round, and that fits right inside, snug inside the bushing mounting hole. Now the one on the passenger side is almost identical, but it's smaller, and it allows for play inside that bushing. So you don't want to center off that one. You want to center off the driver's side. Why the BMW engineers did that is beyond me. But then what I would do is I would start here, go over to that front one on the passenger side, and then work my way to either of the 2 rear mounting positions. Make sure you torque the spec, and you're ready to go. So I didn't find a whole lot of videos that I found helpful with regard to doing M3 bushings on an E90X chassis. So hopefully this helps people in the future. As always, thanks for watching. In my next video, I'm going to be going over all of the different suspension modifications that I did, and hopefully be getting this car lined and back on the road so I can give a really thorough review of all the modifications.